The Nevada desert is a place of secrets, a vast sunburned expanse where the earth seems to hold its breath. At dusk, the horizon glows with a bruised purple, and the air hums with a silence so profound it feels alive. Somewhere out there, beyond the sagebrush and the cracked earth, past forgotten dirt roads that twist like veins through the wilderness, lies a story that refuses to die. It's a story of a man named Bob Lazar, a tinkerer, a dreamer, a reluctant heretic who stumbled into a mystery so vast it would reshape his life and the world's imagination. Robert Scott Lazar was born on January 26, 1959, in Coral Gables, Florida, a place of humid breezes and pastel sunsets, far removed from the arid desolation where his name would become legend. As a boy, Bob was restless, his mind a spark that caught on anything mechanical. Rocket engines, circuit boards, lasers, anything that whirred, sparked, or exploded held him captive. By high school, he was building jet engines in his garage, rigging bicycles with propulsion systems that left scorch marks on the driveway. His friends called him a genius. His neighbors called him a nuisance. But Bob didn't care. He was chasing something bigger than approval, a glimpse of the impossible. By the early 1980s, Bob had left the humid sprawl of Florida for the neon pulse of Las Vegas. The city was a paradox, a glittering oasis in a sea of dust, where dreams of wealth and reinvention collided with the stark reality of the desert. Bob found work as a technician, tinkering with electronics and dabbling in side hustles, repairing slot machines, building experimental gadgets. But his ambitions stretched further. He claimed to have worked at Los Alamos National Laboratory in New Mexico, a hallowed ground of science where the atomic bomb was born. Official records are murky, like a photograph left too long in the sun. Some say he was a low-level contractor, fixing equipment in the shadows of greater minds. Others whisper he was more, a physicist on classified projects, his name scrubbed from the archives to protect secrets too heavy to bear. A 1982 Los Alamos phone book lists him as a technician, and a local newspaper article mentions a young Bob Lazar working on particle accelerators, his eyes alight with the thrill of discovery. These fragments are all that remain, breadcrumbs in a trail that vanishes into the sand. It was in 1988 that Bob's life took a turn toward the extraordinary. A chance meeting, a whispered recommendation, and suddenly he was being vetted for a job so secretive it required polygraphs and oaths of silence. He was driven through the desert in a blacked-out bus, the windows painted to obscure the world outside. The destination, a facility known only as S4, a shadow within the shadow of the infamous Area 51, nestled near the dry bed of Papoose Lake. The air was thick with tension, the kind that settles in your chest like dust you can't cough out. Bob, with his boyish curiosity and unshakable confidence, stepped into a world he could never unsee. S4 was no ordinary base. According to Bob, it was carved into the mountainside, its hangars disguised as natural rock, seamless and silent. The bay doors opened with a precision that felt unnatural, like the mountain itself was breathing. Inside, he saw them, 9 extraterrestrial craft, each distinct, each impossible. Some were sleek, like polished silver. Others were angular, with organic curves that defied human engineering. One, which Bob would later call the sport model, shimmered faintly, its surface cold and smooth, like liquid metal frozen in time. It stood on delicate landing gear, hovering just above the hangar floor as if impatient to move. There were no seams, no bolts, no signs of human hands. It was alien in every sense of the word. Bob's job was to reverse engineer the propulsion system of the sport model. He was handed briefings, classified documents that spoke of technology beyond comprehension. The craft, he was told, ran on a reactor powered by an element not found on Earth, element 115, a substance so rare it didn't exist on the periodic table in 1988. This isotope, Bob claimed, generated gravity waves, bending space-time itself to allow the craft to slip between points in the universe as easily as a stone skips across water. The reactor was small, no larger than a basketball, yet it produced no heat, no sound, only a faint hum that vibrated in your bones. Bob described the interior of the craft: low ceilings, small seats, a minimalist design that suggested beings no taller than 4 feet. A single column ran from floor to ceiling, the heart of the reactor glowing faintly when activated. There were no control panels, no wires, just smooth, curved walls that seemed to pulse with purpose. The briefings went further, claiming the craft originated from the Zeta Reticuli star system, 39 light-years away. They spoke of contact dating back to the 1940s, of materials recovered from crashes, of a government that knew far more than it admitted. Bob read these words in a sterile room, under the watchful eyes of armed guards, his every move monitored. The air at S4 was heavy with paranoia. Conversations were forbidden outside designated areas. Colleagues were strangers. Their work compartmentalized to prevent the full picture from emerging. Bob felt like a cog in a machine he couldn't understand, a scientist tasked with solving a puzzle without seeing the box it came in. But it wasn't just the technology that unsettled him. It was the secrecy, the sense that he was touching something humanity wasn't ready for. He saw biometric hand scanners, devices that measured bone length for identification, technology decades ahead of its time. He heard whispers of test flights, of craft lifting silently into the night sky, defying gravity with a grace that mocked human engineering. One night, he claimed, he watched the sport model hover above the desert floor, its glow pulsing like a heartbeat. It moved without sound, darting at angles that broke every rule of physics he knew. It wasn't flying, it was falling through space, guided by forces he could barely comprehend. Bob's curiosity, once a spark, became a fire. He wanted to know more, to understand the why behind the what. But questions were dangerous at S4. The guards, the surveillance, the blacked-out buses, they were reminders that he was a guest in a world that didn't belong to him. He began to feel the weight of eyes on him, even outside the base. A car parked too long outside his Las Vegas home. A helicopter circling low at night. The phone line clicking, as if someone were listening. His wife, Carol, noticed it too. The way their conversations felt shadowed. The way strangers seemed to linger, just out of sight. By early 1989, Bob was at a crossroads. He could stay silent, keep his head down, and hope the government's gaze would pass over him. Or he could speak, risk everything, and let the world know what he'd seen. The choice wasn't easy. Fear gnawed at him. Fear of disappearing, of becoming another name erased from records. But curiosity, that old spark, burned brighter. He couldn't unsee the sport model, couldn't forget the hum of the reactor or the words in those briefings. He was a scientist, and scientists don't bury truth, no matter the cost. So one spring evening, Bob made a decision that would change everything. He contacted George Knapp, an investigative journalist at KLAS TV in Las Vegas, a man known for chasing stories others wouldn't touch. Under the alias Dennis, his face obscured in shadow, Bob sat before a camera and spoke. His voice was steady, his words precise. He described S4, the 9 craft, the gravity amplifiers, element 115. He spoke of a government hiding the greatest discovery in human history. The interview aired in May 1989, and the world took notice. Area 51, once a whisper among conspiracy theorists, became a household name. Bob Lazar, the tinkerer from Coral Gables, became the man who cracked open the desert's secrets. But the desert doesn't give up its secrets easily. The broadcast sparked a firestorm. UFO enthusiasts hailed Bob as a hero, a whistleblower who dared to defy the machine. Skeptics called him a fraud, pointing to his missing academic records from MIT and Caltech, his murky employment history at Los Alamos. The government remained silent, neither confirming nor denying his claims. Bob's life began to unravel. His phone was tapped, his home watched, friends drifted away, wary of the spotlight. The scientific community dismissed him, and yet some details he shared, the hand scanners, the flight schedules, began to find echoes in later discoveries. Satellite imagery hinted at structures near Papoose Lake. Whispers from other insiders suggested S4 might not be a fiction. As Bob stood on the edge of this new reality, the desert stretched out before him, vast and unyielding. He had opened a door, and there was no closing it. The mystery of S4, of the sport model, of element 115, was no longer his alone. It belonged to the world now, a question mark hanging in the Nevada sky, waiting for answers that might never come. The desert night was a canvas of stars, each pinprick of light, a reminder of how small the world felt and how vast it might actually be. For Bob Lazar, the journey to S4 was not just a drive through the Nevada wilderness. It was a descent into a reality that bent the edges of reason. Each trip in the blacked-out bus, its windows sealed against the outside world, felt like crossing a threshold. The air inside was stale, heavy with the scent of anticipation and dread. Bob sat among other scientists, their faces obscured by the dim light, their silence enforced by the armed guards who watched with unblinking eyes. No one spoke, no one asked questions. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the faint crunch of gravel beneath the tires, leading them deeper into the heart of the secret. S4 was a fortress of shadows, carved into the mountainside near Papoose Lake, a place so remote it seemed to exist outside of time. Bob described the hangars as a marvel of deception. Massive bay doors blended seamlessly into the rock, their edges invisible until they slid open with a silence that felt wrong, like the mountain was holding its breath. Inside, the air was cool, sterile, and charged with a strange electricity. The first time Bob stepped into the hangar, his heart raced, not with fear, but with awe. Before him stood the sport model, one of 9 extraterrestrial craft, its metallic surface gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. It was sleek, no larger than a small plane, with a hull that seemed to shimmer as if it were not entirely bound to the physical world. Its curves were organic, almost alive, and when Bob reached out to touch it, the surface was cold, smooth, and impossibly light, like brushing against a dream made solid. His job was to unravel the impossible, to reverse engineer the propulsion system of a craft that defied every principle he'd learned as a scientist. The briefings he was given were sparse, written in a clinical tone that belied their staggering implications. They described a reactor at the craft's core, a device powered by element 115, an isotope unknown to Earth's periodic table in 1988. This element, the documents claimed, generated gravity waves, manipulating space-time to allow the craft to move not through thrust, but through distortion. The reactor was a marvel of simplicity, a small sphere no larger than a grapefruit that emitted no heat, no radiation, only a faint vibration that seemed to resonate in Bob's chest. 3 gravity amplifiers, arranged in a triangle beneath the craft's floor, channeled this energy, bending the fabric of reality to pull the ship forward as if it were falling through space itself. The briefings hinted at origins far beyond Earth, Zeta Reticuli, a binary star system 39 light-years away, and spoke of contact dating back to the 1940s, of craft recovered from crashes, of technology so advanced it felt like magic. Bob's days at S4 were a blur of wonder and frustration. He worked in a sterile lab, surrounded by equipment that seemed both familiar and alien. Oscilloscopes, spectrometers, and sensors lined the walls, but their readings made no sense. The craft's reactor produced energy in ways that defied measurement, its output spiking in patterns that suggested intelligence, not mechanics. Bob sketched diagrams in his notebook, trying to map the flow of energy from the reactor to the amplifiers, but the system was elusive, like trying to capture a shadow. His colleagues, faceless figures in lab coats, worked in isolation, each assigned a narrow piece of the puzzle. Questions were discouraged. Collaboration was forbidden. The atmosphere was one of controlled paranoia, with security cameras in every corner and guards who materialized silently, their presence a constant reminder of the stakes. One evening, Bob was allowed to witness a test flight. The sport model was moved to an outdoor platform, its glow pulsing faintly in the desert darkness. As the reactor powered up, the air seemed to thicken, and a low hum filled the night, more felt than heard. The craft lifted off the ground, effortless and silent, hovering like a leaf suspended in water. Then, in a blink, it darted sideways, stopped, and tilted at an angle that mocked inertia. It moved with a fluidity that no human aircraft could match, its path unpredictable, almost playful. Bob stood frozen, his breath caught in his throat. This was no prototype, no stolen Soviet tech. This was something else, something that belonged to the stars. But the wonder came with a price. The more Bob learned, the more he felt the weight of S4's secrecy. He noticed the way guards lingered near his workstation, the way his phone calls at home were punctuated by faint clicks. His wife, Carol, began to sense it too. The unease of being watched, the feeling that their quiet Las Vegas life was no longer their own. One night, as they sat on their porch, a helicopter circled low overhead, its spotlight sweeping the street. Carol's hand tightened on Bob's, her voice a whisper. "What have you gotten us into?" she asked. Bob didn't have an answer, only a growing sense that he was a pawn in a game he couldn't see. The briefings offered glimpses of a larger truth. One document described the craft's occupants, small humanoid beings with large eyes and delicate frames, their biology as alien as their technology. Another spoke of a long history of interaction, of agreements made and broken, of a government that had chosen secrecy over revelation. Bob read these words with a mix of fascination and dread. He was a scientist, trained to seek evidence, but here evidence was guarded like a state secret. He began to question not just the technology, but the why of it all. Why hide this? Why keep humanity in the dark? The answers, if they existed, were locked behind doors he couldn't open. His curiosity, once a spark, was now ablaze, but it was tempered by fear. He started to notice patterns: cars parked too long outside his home, strangers who seemed to know his name. One night, he found a small device under his car, its purpose unclear but its presence unmistakable. He didn't tell Carol, not wanting to deepen her worry, but the weight of it settled in his bones. At S4, the rules tightened. He was subjected to more polygraphs, each question probing deeper into his loyalty, his intentions. "Have you discussed your work with anyone?" the examiner asked, his eyes cold. Bob shook his head, but the lie detector's needles twitched, as if sensing the questions burning in his mind. The turning point came one Wednesday night in early 1989. Bob had heard whispers of regular test flights conducted under the cover of darkness when the desert was empty. He couldn't keep it to himself any longer. He gathered a small group of friends, Gene Huff, a fellow physicist, Carol, and a couple of trusted confidants, and drove them to a remote spot overlooking Papoose Lake. Armed with binoculars, a camcorder, and a mix of excitement and dread, they waited in the dark. The desert was silent, save for the rustle of wind through the sagebrush. Then, just after midnight, a glowing orb appeared above the mountains. It hovered, pulsed, then shot across the sky at impossible angles, up, sideways, down, defying every law of physics Bob knew. The group watched, breathless, as the light danced, then vanished. "That's it," Bob whispered. "That's the sport model." They returned the next week, and the week after, each time witnessing the same phenomenon. The footage they captured was shaky, just fleeting glimpses of light against the black sky, but for Bob, it was proof. He wasn't crazy. He wasn't alone. But on their third trip, the desert betrayed them. Spotlights pierced the darkness, and military vehicles surrounded their position. Armed guards emerged, their voices sharp, their questions sharper. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" Bob's heart pounded as their cameras were confiscated, their names recorded. He knew he'd crossed a line, one that could cost him everything. The next day, he was summoned back to S4. His badge no longer worked. In a small, windowless room, he faced a panel of officials who presented transcripts of his phone calls, private conversations with Carol, with friends. They knew everything. "You've breached national security," one said, his voice flat but menacing. "There will be consequences." Bob felt the walls closing in, the desert's vastness shrinking to the size of that room. He was no longer a scientist studying the stars. He was a liability, a loose thread in a tapestry of secrets. But Bob Lazar was not a man to be silenced. The fear was real, but so was the truth he'd seen. As he left SO4 for the last time, the sport model's glow lingered in his mind, a beacon of something greater. He knew what he had to do. The world deserved to know, even if it meant risking everything: his career, his safety, his life. The desert had whispered its secrets to him, and now it was time to speak. The Nevada desert doesn't forgive those who disturb its silence. Its vastness, once a canvas for Bob Lazar's curiosity, had become a stage for consequences. After the night of the desert stakeout, when armed guards descended on him and his friends under the cold glare of spotlights, Bob knew he'd crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The air at S4, already thick with paranoia, turned suffocating. His badge was deactivated, his access to the hangars severed. In a sterile interrogation room, lit by a single flickering bulb, he faced men in suits whose faces he'd never forget, but whose names he'd never know. They slid transcripts of his phone calls across the table, private moments with Carol, casual talks with Gene Huff, words he thought were his alone. "You've endangered national security," one said, his voice like gravel. "You have no idea what you've done." Bob's heart pounded, but he held their gaze, his scientist's mind racing for a way out of a trap he hadn't seen closing. The drive back to Las Vegas was a blur, the city's neon lights mocking the darkness that now clung to him. He told Carol everything, not just about the craft, the gravity amplifiers, or Element 115, but about the fear that had taken root in his chest. Her eyes, usually warm with understanding, were wide with worry. "They're watching us, aren't they?" she whispered, glancing at the window where the blinds cast long shadows across the living room. Bob nodded, unable to lie. The helicopters that circled their home at night, the cars that lingered too long on their quiet street, the faint clicks on their phone line, they were no longer coincidences. They were warnings. The government, or whoever controlled S4, wanted him to know he was being watched, that his life was no longer entirely his own. Bob was a scientist, not a rebel. He never sought to be a whistleblower, never imagined himself as the man to challenge the unseen powers that guarded the desert's secrets. But the truth he'd seen, the sport model hovering silently, its reactor bending space itself, was too big to bury. It wasn't just about alien technology. It was about humanity's right to know, to understand the universe that stretched beyond the stars. He couldn't stay silent, not when the weight of that knowledge pressed against his ribs like a second heartbeat. So he made a choice that would define him. He reached out to George Knapp, a seasoned investigative journalist at KLAS-TV, a man with a reputation for chasing stories that others dismissed as lunacy. Knapp listened, his eyes narrowing as Bob spoke of S4, of 9 craft hidden in mountain hangars, of a propulsion system that rewrote physics. "You're sure about this?" Knapp asked, his voice steady but laced with skepticism. Bob nodded. "I've seen it. I've touched it. It's real." In May 1989, Bob sat in a dimly lit studio, his face obscured in shadow, his voice altered to protect his identity. Under the alias Dennis, he told the world about S4. He described the sport model's sleek curves, the reactor's hum, the gravity amplifiers that made the impossible possible. He spoke of Element 115, a substance not yet discovered by human science, and of briefings that hinted at extraterrestrial origins in the Zeta Reticuli system. His words were calm, precise, the voice of a scientist, not a dreamer. When the broadcast aired, it was like a spark in dry grass. Area 51, a name once whispered in conspiracy circles, exploded into public consciousness. UFO enthusiasts called him a hero, a truth-teller who dared to lift the veil. Skeptics scoffed, demanding proof he couldn't provide, diplomas from MIT and Caltech that had vanished, employment records from Los Alamos that were maddeningly inconsistent. The fallout was immediate and brutal. Journalists descended on Bob's modest Las Vegas home, their cameras flashing like vultures circling a carcass. Friends grew distant, wary of the spotlight that now burned too brightly. The scientific community, once a place where Bob felt at home, turned its back. His claims of degrees from prestigious institutions were met with blank records, no transcripts, no yearbooks, no trace of Robert Scott Lazar. He insisted the government had erased his past, a surgical strike to discredit him. A 1982 Los Alamos phone book listed him as a technician, and a newspaper clipping mentioned his work on particle accelerators, but these were crumbs, not proof. Skeptics painted him as a fraud, a low-level contractor with a knack for storytelling. Believers saw a man targeted, his life rewritten to make his truth seem like fiction. The harassment intensified. Bob's phone rang at odd hours, the caller silent but present, a reminder of the eyes that never blinked. Carol found a small listening device tucked behind a picture frame, its wires glinting in the lamplight. One night, as they drove home from dinner, a black SUV trailed them, its headlights unwavering in the rearview mirror. Bob's hands tightened on the steering wheel, his mind racing. "They don't want to kill me," he told Carol, his voice steady but strained. "They want me to feel trapped." And trapped he was. His small business repairing electronics faltered as clients vanished, spooked by the rumors swirling around him. Invitations to scientific conferences stopped coming. The world he'd built, piece by meticulous piece, was crumbling. Yet amidst the chaos, there were moments of strange validation. A few who knew Bob from Los Alamos confirmed he'd worked there, not as a janitor, but as someone with access to sensitive projects. A grainy photo surfaced of a biometric hand scanner, identical to the one Bob described at S4, a device that measured bone length for identification, technology unheard of in 1989. Satellite images of Papoose Lake revealed anomalies, structures that didn't appear on official maps. These fragments fueled the believers, who saw Bob as a martyr, a man punished for daring to speak. But for every supporter, there were 10 skeptics, their voices louder, their accusations sharper. "If he's telling the truth, where's the evidence?" they demanded. Bob had no artifacts, no stolen samples of element 115, only his words and the unshakable memory of that glowing craft. The pressure took its toll. Carol, once his anchor, began to fray under the strain. Their conversations grew tense, punctuated by long silences. "I believe you," she'd say, but her eyes betrayed her fear, not of aliens, but of a life unraveling. Bob felt it too, the isolation creeping in like desert cold. He began to question himself, not his story, but his decision to tell it. Had he been reckless? Had he underestimated the cost? In quiet moments, alone with his thoughts, he'd close his eyes and see the sport model, its surface shimmering, its hum a siren call. It was real. He knew it. But knowing wasn't enough when the world demanded proof he couldn't give. One night, as he sat at his workbench, surrounded by half-built circuits and scattered notes, Bob made another decision. He couldn't fight the government's machine, couldn't outrun the shadows that followed him. But he could keep speaking, keep the truth alive, even if it meant standing alone. He contacted Gnap again, this time shedding the alias. In a second interview, his face fully revealed, Bob doubled down. He described the hangars, the reactor, the way the craft moved like a thought made manifest. The broadcast reached millions, cementing Area 51 as a cultural touchstone. UFO forums buzzed. Conspiracy theorists scribbled diagrams of gravity amplifiers, and ordinary people looked to the night sky with new questions. But the louder Bob's voice grew, the tighter the noose around him became. His home was searched, his business audited. A 1990 arrest for aiding a prostitution ring, a charge unrelated to UFOs but perfectly timed to tarnish his name, felt like a calculated blow. The media pounced, painting him as a criminal, a charlatan. Bob pleaded guilty to a lesser charge, but the damage was done. To the public, he was no longer the scientist who touched the stars. He was a man with a rap sheet, his credibility in tatters. Yet even as the world turned against him, Bob didn't waver. "I'm not asking you to believe me," he told Gannap in a follow-up interview, his voice calm but weary. "I'm telling you what I saw. Do with it what you will." In the desert's silence, Bob Lazar stood at a crossroads. The truth he'd shared had set him free and caged him all at once. The sport model, the hangars, the secrets of S4, they were no longer just his burden. They were the world's now, a spark that refused to die. But as the consequences mounted, Bob began to wonder, was the truth worth the price? The answer lay ahead, in the battles he'd face, the doubts he'd endure, and the quiet strength that would keep him standing, a lone figure against the vast, unyielding desert. The desert wind carried a restless edge, whispering through the streets of Las Vegas, like a warning that refused to be ignored. For Bob Lazar, the world had shifted irreversibly since his televised confession in 1989. The name Area 51 was no longer a whispered rumor among conspiracy theorists. It was a cultural lightning rod, sparking debates in living rooms, radio shows, and smoky barrooms across the country. Bob had opened a door to the unknown, but instead of clarity, he found himself at the center of a storm, one of doubt, ridicule, and unrelenting scrutiny that threatened to sweep away everything he held dear. The aftermath of his KLAS TV interview with George Knapp was like a tidal wave. The public's fascination with Area 51 was insatiable, fueled by Bob's calm, precise descriptions of the sport model craft, its gravity-defying propulsion, and the mysterious element 115. UFO enthusiasts flocked to Nevada, camping along the dusty roads near Groom Lake, their binoculars trained on the sky, hoping for a glimpse of the impossible. Bookstores stocked new titles on extraterrestrial life, and talk shows buzzed with speculation. Bob's story had ignited a spark, but it was a fire he couldn't control. The same world that hung on his every word also turned against him, dissecting his life with a scalpel's precision, searching for cracks in his narrative. Skeptics led the charge, their voices loud and unrelenting. They pointed to the holes in Bob's past, his missing academic records from MIT and Caltech, institutions that had no trace of him in their archives. No diplomas, no yearbook photos, no professors who remembered a student named Robert Scott Lazar. Bob insisted his credentials had been erased, a deliberate act by the government to paint him as a fraud. "They didn't just take my degrees," he told Gannap in a follow-up interview, his voice steady but laced with frustration. "They took my history, my identity. They wanted to make me a ghost." To some, this claim was a desperate excuse. To others, it was chilling evidence of a cover-up. A 1982 Los Alamos phone directory listed him as a technician, and a newspaper article from the same year described a young Bob working on particle accelerators, his eyes bright with ambition. But these were fragments, not the ironclad proof the skeptics demanded. The absence of records became a weapon wielded by those who called him a con man, a storyteller with a knack for science fiction. The media, once intrigued by Bob's tale, turned predatory. Tabloids painted him as a crackpot, a man chasing fame through outlandish lies. Mainstream outlets were kinder, but no less damaging, framing him as an enigma whose story didn't add up. Journalists camped outside his Las Vegas home, their questions relentless. "Where's the evidence, Bob? Why should we believe you?" He tried to explain the compartmentalization at S4, the lack of physical artifacts, the secrecy that bound his hands. But his words were drowned out by the clamor of doubt. The scientific community, once a haven for his restless mind, was particularly brutal. Colleagues he'd never met dismissed him as a fraud, their statements dripping with condescension. No serious physicist would make such claims, one professor declared in a widely quoted article. Gravity manipulation, element 115, it's nonsense. Bob read these words in the quiet of his living room, his jaw tight, his hands clenched around a cup of coffee gone cold. The personal toll was heavier still. Carol, his anchor through the chaos, began to buckle under the strain. The constant surveillance, the helicopters circling at night, the unmarked cars parked down the street, had turned their home into a fortress of unease. She found another listening device, this time hidden in a smoke detector, its tiny red light blinking like an accusing eye. "I can't live like this, Bob," she said one evening, her voice breaking as she stood by the kitchen window, staring into the darkness. Bob wanted to comfort her, to promise it would end, but the words caught in his throat. He saw the fear in her eyes, not just of the government, but of him, of the man he was becoming under the weight of his own truth. Their marriage, once a partnership of quiet strength, began to fray, each argument a thread pulled loose. The harassment wasn't limited to surveillance. In 1990, Bob was arrested on charges of aiding and abetting a prostitution operation, a scandal that seemed to come from nowhere. The details were murky, a business deal gone wrong, a connection to a friend's illicit activities, but the timing felt orchestrated. The media pounced, splashing headlines that branded him a criminal, a man whose credibility was now irrevocably tainted. Bob pleaded guilty to a lesser charge, avoiding jail but not the stigma. To skeptics, it was the final nail in his coffin. To supporters, it was proof of a targeted campaign to destroy him. "They don't need to silence you with a bullet," Gene Huff told him over a beer, his voice low. "They just need to make sure no one listens." Bob nodded, the weight of those words settling like dust in his lungs. Yet amidst the storm, there were glimmers of validation. A few former Los Alamos colleagues quietly confirmed he'd worked there, not as a janitor, but as someone with access to classified projects. A retired security officer, speaking anonymously to a UFO researcher, described a facility near Papoose Lake that matched Bob's descriptions. Hangars carved into the mountain, guarded by biometric scanners. Photos surfaced of a hand scanner identical to the one Bob had mentioned, a device that measured bone length for identification, technology that seemed futuristic in 1989. Satellite imagery revealed structures near Groom Lake that didn't appear on public maps, fueling speculations about S4's existence. These fragments were enough to keep the believers' faith alive, but they were no match for the tide of skepticism that threatened to drown Bob's story. He tried to move forward, to reclaim the life he'd had before S4. He opened United Nuclear, a small scientific supply company selling chemicals, lab equipment, and high-voltage gear. It was a return to his roots, a way to ground himself in the tangible world of science. But even this was tainted by the shadow of his past. Regulatory agencies inspected his business with unusual frequency, packages were delayed, and orders mysteriously canceled. Bob didn't complain, didn't speculate about conspiracies. He just kept working, his hands steady as he measured powders and packed shipments. But in quiet moments, when the shop was empty, he'd sketch diagrams of the sport model, its reactor and amplifiers drawn with a precision that betrayed his obsession. The craft was still with him, a ghost that lingered in every corner of his mind. The public's fascination with Area 51 grew, but Bob's role in it became a double-edged sword. He was invited to speak at UFO conferences, his name a draw for crowds hungry for answers. But he declined most offers, wary of being cast as a sideshow act. When he did speak, it was with a quiet intensity, his words unchanged from that first interview. He described the hangars, the craft, the hum of the reactor, never embellishing, never retreating. "I'm not here to convince you," he told one small audience, his eyes scanning the room. "I'm here to tell you what I saw. That's all I've got." Some in the crowd nodded, their faces alight with belief. Others crossed their arms, their skepticism a wall he couldn't breach. The storm of doubt was relentless, but Bob stood firm, a lone figure against the desert's vastness. He knew the truth he carried was a burden, one that had cost him his reputation, his peace, and perhaps his future. But it was also a beacon, a light that refused to be extinguished. The sport model, with its impossible grace, was more than a memory. It was a call to keep fighting, to keep speaking, even as the world tried to shout him down. As the 1990s dawned, Bob Lazar faced a choice: retreat into silence or confront the forces that sought to erase him. The desert, with its secrets and its silence, waited for his answer. The Nevada desert, with its endless expanse of sand and secrets, seemed to mock Bob Lazar's solitude. By the early 1990s, his life had become a paradox. He was both a pariah and a prophet, a man whose name echoed in the halls of UFO conventions and the pages of scientific journals, yet whose existence felt increasingly untethered. The storm of doubt that followed his 1989 KLIS TV interview had not abated. If anything, it had grown fiercer, a relentless wind eroding the edges of his resolve. But beneath the skepticism and ridicule, something else was stirring, a quiet, persistent curiosity about the science behind his claims. Could a man like Bob, with his unverified credentials and tarnished reputation, have stumbled upon a truth so profound it could rewrite the laws of physics? The question hung in the air, as unyielding as the desert sun. Bob's story hinged on the extraordinary, a propulsion system that defied gravity, powered by an element unknown to human science. Element 115, he claimed, was the heart of the sport model's reactor, a substance capable of generating gravity waves that bent space-time, allowing the craft to slip through the universe like a stone through water. In 1989, when he first spoke of it, element 115 was a phantom, a theoretical isotope residing in the island of stability on the periodic table, a place where super heavy elements might exist without collapsing into decay. Scientists scoffed, dismissing it as science fiction. But Bob's descriptions were precise, almost clinical. He spoke of a reactor no larger than a grapefruit, emitting no heat, no radiation, only a faint hum that seemed to resonate with the fabric of reality itself. The gravity amplifiers, three spherical devices arranged in a triangle beneath the craft, channeled this energy, creating a distortion bubble that pulled the ship forward, not flying, but falling through warped space. The scientific community, bound by rigor and evidence, was quick to reject him. "It's impossible," declared a physicist from Stanford in a 1990 interview, his voice dripping with disdain. "Gravity manipulation requires energy on a scale we can't even theorize, let alone achieve." Others pointed to Bob's lack of verifiable credentials, arguing that a true scientist would have proof, equations, data, a sample of this mythical element. Yet Bob's calm delivery, his detailed diagrams of the reactor and amplifiers, and his unwavering consistency gnawed at the edges of their certainty. He wasn't speaking in vague generalities. He described waveguides, energy flows, and a propulsion system that, while fantastical, echoed emerging theories in theoretical physics, wormholes, space-time curvature, gravitational lensing. A few fringe researchers, those unafraid of professional exile, began to wonder, what if he was right? Bob himself was humbled by the technology he'd seen. In rare interviews, he admitted he didn't fully understand it. "It was like handing a jet engine to a blacksmith in the 1800s, he told George Knapp in 1991, his voice soft but resolute. "I could see the pieces, measure the effects, but the whole picture, that was beyond me." At S4, his work had been compartmentalized, his access limited to the propulsion system. He wasn't allowed to speak to the engineers studying the craft's metallurgy or the physicists analyzing its control systems. The secrecy was suffocating, designed to keep the truth fragmented. Yet those brief glimpses of the sport model, its seamless hull, its low ceilings built for beings no taller than 4 feet, its reactor glowing with an otherworldly light, had burned themselves into his memory. He sketched them obsessively in his United Nuclear shop, surrounded by beakers and coils, as if drawing the craft could anchor him to a truth the world refused to see. Outside the scientific realm, Bob's personal life continued to unravel. The harassment that began after his desert stakeouts had not stopped. His phone lines clicked, his mail arrived opened, and unmarked cars trailed him to the grocery store. Carol, his wife, was reaching her breaking point. One night, as they sat in their dimly lit kitchen, she slammed a glass on the counter, her voice trembling. "This isn't just about you anymore, Bob. It's us. It's our life." The arrest in 1990 for aiding a prostitution operation had been a public humiliation, a scarlet letter that painted him as unreliable, even criminal. Though the charges were reduced, the damage lingered. Friends stopped calling, clients abandoned his business, and the constant scrutiny left Carol feeling like a prisoner in her own home. Bob wanted to protect her, to promise a return to normalcy, but the desert's secrets had claimed too much of him. Yet amidst the personal toll, the world was beginning to grapple with Bob's claims in ways he hadn't anticipated. UFO enthusiasts, emboldened by his story, organized expeditions to the edges of Area 51, their campfires dotting the desert like stars fallen to Earth. They called themselves Lazarates, a term Bob found both flattering and uncomfortable. They pored over his interviews, recreating his diagrams of the sport model in crude 3D models, speculating about its origins. Some linked his story to older UFO lore, Roswell's crashed saucer, the Rendlesham Forest incident, seeing S4 as the key to a decades-long cover-up. Others, less reverent, turned his tale into pop culture fodder, with Area 51 t-shirts and alien-themed slot machines popping up in Las Vegas gift shops. Bob hated the sensationalism, the way his truth was reduced to a carnival act, but he couldn't stop it. The story had outgrown him. Small validations kept him afloat. In 1993, a grainy photograph surfaced of a biometric hand scanner used at a military facility, its design matching Bob's description from S4, a device that measured bone length for identification, technology that seemed futuristic in 1989. A retired Air Force engineer, speaking anonymously to a UFO researcher, confirmed the existence of a facility near Papoose Lake, its hangars hidden in the mountainside. Satellite imagery, scrutinized by amateur analysts, revealed anomalies, roads leading to nowhere, structures that vanished from official maps. These fragments were not proof, but they were enough to keep the believers hopeful, to keep Bob's story alive in the face of relentless doubt. The scientific community, though largely dismissive, wasn't entirely immune to Bob's influence. A handful of physicists, working in the shadows of academia, began exploring the boundaries of propulsion. Papers on inertial dampening and gravitational shielding appeared in obscure journals, their authors citing theoretical possibilities that echoed Bob's claims. One researcher, a young professor at a small university, contacted Bob in 1992, asking for details about the gravity amplifiers. Bob met him in a quiet diner outside Las Vegas, sketching diagrams on a napkin as the jukebox played softly in the background. "I don't have the math," Bob admitted, his eyes tired but earnest, "but I saw it work. It's real." The professor left unconvinced but intrigued, his mind buzzing with questions that mainstream science wouldn't entertain. Bob's life at United Nuclear offered a semblance of normalcy, but it was a fragile facade. Regulatory inspections continued, each one more invasive than the last. A shipment of chemicals was seized, labeled hazardous, despite meeting all regulations. Bob suspected interference, but he had no proof, only the quiet certainty that the government hadn't forgotten him. He kept working, filling orders for lab equipment, his hands steady, even as his mind wandered back to S4. In the evenings, he'd sit outside his shop, staring at the stars, the same stars that had once seemed so close in the hangar's glow. He didn't talk about it much, not even with Carol, but the craft was always there, a shadow in his thoughts. The world, too, was changing. The early 1990s saw a surge in UFO interest, fueled by Bob's revelations and a growing distrust of government secrecy. The X-Files premiered in 1993, its tales of alien conspiracies resonating with a public hungry for answers. Bob watched the show with a wry smile, recognizing echoes of his own story in its fictional shadows. He wasn't Mulder, chasing truth with reckless abandon, but he understood the impulse. The world was waking up to the possibility that something was out there, hidden behind the desert's veil, and Bob's voice, though battered, was part of that awakening. As the decade wore on, Bob faced a new challenge, not just to survive the storm of doubt, but to hold on to the truth that defined him. The sport model, with its impossible grace, was more than a memory. It was a call to keep going, to keep speaking, even as the world tried to drown him out. The desert, with its secrets and its silence, was watching, waiting for what he would do next. And Bob, standing at the edge of his own story, knew the fight was far from over. The Nevada desert, with its stark beauty and unyielding silence, had become both a prison and a muse for Bob Lazar. By the mid-1990s, his life was a tightrope walk between obscurity and infamy, a delicate balance maintained by sheer stubbornness. The storm of doubt that had battered him since his 1989 revelations had not subsided, but it had shifted, its currents now carrying his story far beyond the dusty roads of Las Vegas. The name Area 51 was no longer just a whisper in conspiracy circles. It was a global phenomenon, a shorthand for secrets too vast to grasp. Bob, the reluctant whistleblower, found himself at the heart of a movement he hadn't meant to start, his words rippling through a world hungry for answers, yet still quick to judge. The public's fascination with Bob's claims grew like wildfire, fueled by a culture increasingly skeptical of authority. The X-Files, with its brooding agents and alien conspiracies, had become a cultural juggernaut, and Bob's story felt like its real-world counterpart. UFO conventions drew thousands, their attendees clutching grainy photos of glowing orbs and dog-eared copies of his interviews. In smoky conference halls, enthusiasts debated the sport model's propulsion system, sketching gravity amplifiers on napkins and speculating about Element 115. Bob's name was invoked like a talisman, a symbol of defiance against a government that hid the truth. Yet he shunned these gatherings, wary of being reduced to a cult figure. "I'm not a prophet," he told George Knapp in a rare 1994 interview, his voice edged with fatigue. "I'm just a guy who saw something and couldn't stay quiet." But silence was no longer an option. The world had latched onto his story, twisting it into something larger than himself. In Japan, a documentary about Area 51 aired, featuring Bob's testimony translated into subtitles, his calm demeanor captivating audiences across the Pacific. In Europe, UFO researchers cited him in academic papers, their tone cautious but intrigued. Even in the Nevada desert, tourists flocked to the Extraterrestrial Highway, a stretch of road near Area 51 renamed by the state to capitalize on the frenzy. Diners sold Lazar burgers alongside alien-themed souvenirs, a commercialization that made Bob wince. He wanted the truth to stand on its own, not to be packaged as a roadside attraction, but the world had other plans. The scientific community remained a battleground. Most physicists dismissed Bob's claims as fantasy, their rebuttals sharp and academic. "Gravity manipulation is a pipe dream," a Caltech professor declared at a 1995 conference, his words echoed by peers who saw Bob as a cautionary tale of pseudoscience. Yet a small but growing cadre of researchers, outsiders, mavericks, dreamers, found themselves drawn to his ideas. In a basement lab in Colorado, a young engineer built a crude model of a gravity amplifier, its coils humming faintly but producing nothing close to the sport model's grace. In Germany, a physicist published a paper on exotic matter and space-time distortion, citing Bob's descriptions as speculative but thought-provoking. These were not endorsements, but questions, seeds planted in the cracks of orthodoxy. Bob, working late in his United Nuclear shop, received letters from these fringe thinkers, their handwriting shaky with excitement. He read them quietly, his eyes lingering on phrases like, "What if you're right?" The personal cost of his truth continued to mount. Carol, his wife, had become a shadow of the woman who once stood by his side. The constant surveillance, the phone taps, the unmarked cars, the strange clicks in their home had eroded her resilience. One night, as they sat in their living room, the power flickered, plunging them into darkness. Carol's voice trembled as she spoke. "I can't do this anymore, Bob. I can't live in a cage." He reached for her hand, but she pulled away, her eyes reflecting a pain he couldn't erase. Their marriage, once a refuge, was crumbling under the weight of his choices. Bob didn't blame her. He blamed the desert, the secrets, the faceless men who had turned his life into a labyrinth of suspicion. The harassment wasn't just personal, it was professional. United Nuclear faced relentless scrutiny, with regulatory agencies inspecting his inventory with a zeal that felt personal. A shipment of chemicals was seized for improper labeling, though Bob knew the paperwork was flawless. A client, a university lab, canceled a large order after a visit from men in suits who asked vague questions about Bob's reliability. He didn't complain, didn't speculate aloud about conspiracies. He just kept working, measuring powders, packing shipments, his hands steady even as his mind churned. But in quiet moments, he'd stare at the sketches on his workbench, diagrams of the sport model, its reactor glowing like a memory he couldn't shake. The craft was still with him, a beacon in the fog of doubt. Yet the ripples of his story were beginning to change the world in ways he hadn't foreseen. In 1996, a retired Navy officer, speaking anonymously to a UFO researcher, described witnessing a test flight near Groom Lake in the 1980s. A craft that moved silently, darting at impossible angles, just as Bob had described. The officer's voice cracked as he spoke, as if the memory still haunted him. Satellite imagery, analyzed by amateur sleuths, revealed structures near Papoose Lake that matched Bob's descriptions of S4's hidden hangars. A former Los Alamos colleague, now working in the private sector, quietly confirmed to a journalist that Bob had worked on classified projects, his role more significant than the technician label suggested. These fragments, though not definitive, were enough to keep the believer's faith burning, to keep Bob's story alive in the face of relentless skepticism. The broader cultural impact was undeniable. Bob's revelations had cracked open a conversation that refused to close. Late-night radio shows, hosted by voices like Art Bell, dissected his claims, their listeners calling in with their own stories of lights in the sky. Filmmakers began producing documentaries, their grainy footage of the Nevada desert accompanied by Bob's voice, steady and unyielding. The internet, still in its infancy, buzzed with early forums where users debated the physics of gravity amplifiers and the ethics of government secrecy. Bob's story had become a skeleton key, unlocking connections to older UFO mysteries, Roswell, Rendlesham, the Phoenix Lights. To some, he was the missing link, the man who tied decades of sightings to a single staggering truth. The government had alien technology, and Bob had seen it. But the weight of that truth was heavy. Bob's health began to falter, the stress manifesting in sleepless nights and a persistent cough he couldn't shake. He avoided mirrors, not wanting to see the lines etched deeper into his face, the toll of a life lived under scrutiny. Carol moved out in 1995, leaving a note that read, "I love you, but I can't share this burden anymore." The emptiness of their home was a new kind of silence, one that echoed the desert's vastness. Bob didn't try to stop her. He knew she deserved a life free of helicopters and shadows. Alone, he turned to his work, to the small comfort of circuits and chemicals, but the sport model was always there, a ghost that refused to fade. In 1997, a small breakthrough came unexpectedly. A physicist at a European conference presented a paper on gravitational wave amplification, a theoretical concept that bore striking similarities to Bob's descriptions. The physicist, unaware of Bob's story, spoke of manipulating space-time with exotic matter, a phrase that sent chills through the UFO community. A copy of the paper reached Bob, sent by a supporter who scrawled, "You were right." He read it late at night, his shop lit by a single lamp, his eyes tracing equations that felt like echoes of S4. It wasn't proof, but it was validation, a flicker of light in the darkness. As the millennium approached, Bob stood at the edge of his own story, a man caught between worlds. The ripples of his truth had spread far beyond his control, inspiring scientists, dreamers, and skeptics alike. The desert, with its secrets and its silence, remained a constant, a reminder of what he'd seen and what he'd lost. The sport model, with its impossible grace, was more than a memory. It was a call to keep fighting, to keep speaking, even as the world wavered between belief and doubt. Bob Lazar, the tinkerer from Coral Gables, had become a symbol not of answers, but of questions, questions that refused to be silenced, questions that demanded the world look to the stars and wonder.